Councillors, we had on our agenda next a confidential item, which is the approval for the change of project scope for the City Rail Link. It seems to me that there is only one aspect of this debate that needs to remain confidential, and that is the quoted costs of the various options for expanding the scope of the scheme. We go out for requests for proposal within about 6 weeks' time. I am very happy for this item to be discussed publicly, because I think, A, it's been in the public arena and interest, but could I please ask you not to mention any figures in relation to the cost of the program on the basis that that would compromise our tendering process. That will, if we compromise that process, we actually add cost to the project and weaken our own position vis-a-vis those that might be tendering to do the work. It would be my suggestion that we take the vote on the recommendations, because the recommendations relate to the cost of the project, that we take that in confidential session, but we hold the discussion around this and the briefing that we receive on it in our open agenda. Is there any objection to that? Okay, so we will proceed on that basis, and if I could ask Alistair Cameron and Ed Siddle, please, to come forward to speak to the paper. Councillors, you'll recall that you had a debate over this in a workshop earlier this week. You know what it's about. You know that what we're trying to do is to future-proof the City Rail Link, because of the enormous success of the shifted mode of transportation. We are now 4 to 5 years ahead of where we projected we would be in terms of heavy rail commuting, and that means that if we completed this project on the original scheme within 7 years of completion of it, we would be looking to expand the scope of the stations with the quite dramatic impact that if you hadn't tunnelled out the stations to the appropriate width, that we would have to close the line within 10 years of opening it in order to do the expanded work. I think that's at the nub of it. We only have to make the decision today to approve the scope of it. We will look later, when we have the request for proposals in and more definitive figures, about whether we do the expanding of the tunnel or we do the complete fit out. And obviously the latter has greater implications for funding than the former. But I'll now pass over to Ed. Are you going to lead on this one?
Yes, I am.
And just ask you to speak to the paper, please. And I don't need to remind officials that the same requirement that we need to keep what has to be commercially sensitive confidential.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good afternoon, councillors. Before I start, I might just mention we've got a few other experts in the room here today who can help if questions arise that I'm not capable of answering. So if I could just introduce those. We've got some staff from Auckland Transport here. We have Cynthia Gillespie and Mark Lambert. Cynthia's the...
Cynthia and Mark like to come forward.
Cynthia's the Executive GM Planning and Investment, and Mark is the Executive GM for Integrated Networks. We've also got our Assurance Manager from Advisian, which is Terry Poynton.
We'll ask Terry if you'd like to come forward too, please.
That's good, and there are others as well. If certain questions come up, we might bring them to the table.
Bring them to the table as required.
Yes, acknowledging that we did have a good discussion on Tuesday about this, the other thing I want to raise is that there were a number of questions that came up both at that discussion and were sent to me subsequent to it. And we've prepared a handout which I could distribute to councillors, but it would need to remain confidential on the same basis as, because there is financial information in it. Now, would you like me to
that would be, I think that would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, so, yes, just to reiterate, the decision that you're being asked to make today is to agree to allow City Rail Link to issue request for proposal documents for an enhanced capacity railway. What this will allow for is for City Rail Link to maximise its role in the new public transport system, which Crown and Council have agreed through the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. A major part of the discussion at the briefing workshop on Tuesday was whether we're doing enough to future-proof through this proposal. I think there are several answers to this question. First, even beyond the future-proofing that we're proposing here, there are still other options which are mentioned in the business case which can expand the capacity even further, such as optimising the rolling stock, for example, by changing seating configurations. Secondly, at a technical level, there's probably a limit to how big you can make the City Rail Link. So thinking about things like 12-car trains has an impact on the rest of the network that may just not be an optimal solution for the kind of railway we're talking about. And if you want further information about that, that's the kind of thing Terry can talk about. Thirdly, and this relates to the handout, of course City Rail Link is not the only investment we're making here. The Auckland Transport Alignment Project has a range of rapid transit network improvements coming from different parts of the city into the centre of the city, and so we shouldn't expect City Rail Link to do the job, carry the load all by itself. The final point I'd make is that we had a think after Tuesday about another way of looking at the capacity challenge. And one of the things we're expecting is that within about 20 to 30 years, there should be about 100,000 trips in the morning peak over 2 hours on public transport. And that's over 2 hours. So the future-proofing we're looking for today gets you to about 54,000 per hour. So we're pretty confident that the future-proofing that we're looking at will be enough to cater for growth over quite a long term. Should we get to a point 30, 40, 50 years in the future where we are at capacity, that's the point at which you start to look at another solution, new lines, similar to what you find in cities like London, where capacity was reached. The next solution was, say, the Crossrail project, which is being built at the moment. I think that's probably enough from me at this point. We might want to move into questions.
Thank you very much, Ed. Alistair, is there anything you want to add to that, or?
No, other than just, I guess, a reminder that if there are issues around the financial implications about this that you want to discuss, we can discuss those in the confidential section.
Yeah, I'll move the resolution at this stage to get it on the table. Could I have a seconder? Deputy Mayor Cashmore. We will go through the recommendations in confidential, and if you do have questions about funding that cannot be raised in our open session, there will be the opportunity under confidential to ask those questions. So let's see what questions we've got now. I'm conscious of the fact that we've all been thoroughly briefed on this, but there were concerns that we raised. I think, Ed, you've addressed the one, is this enough future-proofing? Is it safe? Does it help our safety with the Beresford Square entrance? I see the answers are here. That's very helpful. I'm conscious that councillors haven't had the time to read them yet, but if you can glance read them and ask questions at the same time. Councillor Filipainen, did I see you raise a question?
Thank you, Worship. I've glanced read them. Look, my question is, what are we using as a basis for the population projections that would sort of justify what we need to do? I mean, are we using projected from the census, which is one coming up? I just because there was at the briefing some suggestions as well again that we could use other data. So I just wanted to ask the question around that.
Yeah,
and are we looking at then sort of, just to refine the projections, albeit...
Councillors, through you, Mr Chair, so the modelling that's done for all public transport or for the modelling for the whole network is done through the Auckland Forecasting Centre, and the model is based on census data. have to understand that the limitations of any modelling that's done in any transport system in the world when you're doing census data is you're working on the last census. So we have now only just, we will get the last census data, so I'm talking about the so we're working on the 2013, the last census data will only be uploaded in the next 3 or 4 months it gets released, so.
Chair, I just thought it'd be important publicly anyway for people to know, look,
Yep.
this is what we're using as forecast, so thank you.
If we're relying on the census, we'd better add 10% to that, given it's under pitching.
So just a
Councillor
point of
Cooper.
clarification, so you've moved and it's been seconded, but have you moved C1 or C2? Because there's an option there. That's what I'm not sure of what we're talking about.
Shall I address that when we get into confidential?
Oh, sorry, I
because
wasn't
C1
clear.
and C2
It
relate
wasn't clear,
directly
Mr.
to.
Chairman, whether we were actually having confidential or not from our previous conversation.
No.
Okay, we are. All right.
I foreshadowed that the discussion of the recommendations would occur in confidential because, as you're aware, C1 and 2 relate directly to the alternative costings for the different options. Okay, are there any further questions? Richard Hills.
Oh, well, it is
No.
a question. I thought we were going to debate the wider issues in public as opposed to confidential.
The why I've put the recommendations in confidential is the recommendations relate specifically to the cost, but the debate that can occur here is a debate on any aspect of expanding the scope of CRL other than the costings. Is that clear?
Yes, so we
Okay.
can speak now and speak.
You can, if you've got questions relating to the costings, you'll raise that in confidential. If you've got questions relating to other aspects of the recommendations, you're welcome to raise them in open session.
But we can only debate in confidential.
We can debate. No, we'll have an open comment session, but any comments you want to make in relation to the costings, again, the same rule will apply. That would be done in confidential. So most of this paper in front of us is material that should be available to the public, and the public should hear our debate, but the costing for commercial reasons has to remain confidential, either questions or debate. Okay?
Yeah.
Would you like to take you have a question now?
No, I just wanted.
That was the question, okay?
I wanted to debate it, but I'm not.
No, that's okay. If it relates to costings, we'll hold that over. Councillor Casey.
Yeah, do we have anybody here who's the expert on accessibility?
Yes,
with
we
regard
do.
Oh, good. Can I borrow her for a second?
Elise Copeland.
Here's the issue for me. The new entrance at K Road, for the K Road station at Berriford Square, is not future-proofing, it's actually making the station accessible. And what I want you to talk about is the furore that was caused when Auckland Transport announced it was just going to be the one entrance, and why minimum standards isn't any good to someone who's blind or someone who's disabled trying to get up the slope.
Certainly. Kia ora. My name is Elise Copeland. I'm the Principal Specialist Universal Access and Design within the Auckland Design Office of Auckland Council. And I've been looking at the stations for approximately 2 years. I can certainly attest that Karangahape Station does not currently provide an accessible route to Karangahape Road.
Exactly.
The gradient coming down from Karangahape Road to Karangahape Station is at times 1 in 10. To put that into perspective, people with wheelchairs and other mobility aids find it difficult to impossible to navigate even a 1 in 11, which is a less gradient. And according to the New Zealand standard 4121, footpaths and other things for access should be a maximum of 1 in 12, but actually preferred to be 1 in 14 where you have space. Now, the reason that Karangahape Station or the Mercury Lane entrance does meet legal requirements is because you can legally park in a mobility space and then move into the station entrance, say on Cross Street. Now, That is not the intention of an inner city rail station. People are not arriving by private vehicle to then access the station or leaving the station by private vehicle. So I want to put the point that it's not just people in wheelchairs. This is older adults. 59% of older adults have a disability. Most of those are mobility impairments. This is tourists managing luggage. This is parents managing dual prams. This is people who have vision impairment, who find it very difficult to proceed down steep slopes. Yes, Karangahape Station, as in the Mercury Lane entrance, does meet the current legal requirements, but what I would suggest is that the legal requirements here in New Zealand are simply not good enough. And this type of station entrance would not meet the legal requirements in many other countries, including Australia, UK, Canada, and the US.
But that's what we were building. That's the point I'm making. That's what we'd agreed to build.
Yep.
An inaccessible station. This is being fixed. It's not future-proofing. It's making the station accessible.
I think the answer is it's doing both, and we should applaud it for both reasons.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So just to put it on the record, the Beresford Square entrance will meet all of those requirements very clearly and very capably.
Yes, I can confirm, and this is across all groups, that the Beresford Station entrance is accessible to all groups, and the Disability Advisory Panel, amongst many others, the New Zealand Institute of Architects, myself as Universal Design Specialist, we all support Beresford entrance as an accessible entrance.
Yep. I think what we can all agree here is that the original plans, constrained by the government of the day that wasn't particularly enthusiastic about it, meant cutbacks that had effects of not only not future-proofing, but also making it far more difficult and arguably less safe for people to enter the facility. So thank you very much, Lise. That couldn't have been clearer. Okay, other questions? Councillor Sayers.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just being very careful with the way I put this question, because obviously we're talking about a fair chunk of money, and I just wanted to get clarity for the public, and that we've just gone through the LTP process, and why we're having this discussion now and not as part of the LTP. Perhaps getting clarification on that might be helpful.
I think the short answer to that is that while CRL foreshadowed to Finance and Performance last November that they were looking at the question of adequacy of future-proofing, we did not have their paper at the time that we were going through the LTP. There will be additional expense involved, shared between government and council, and we will be considering, when we get a more precise estimate of the costs, how that money will be raised. It's a fair question. It's not one that officials can answer at this point. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Darby.
Thank you, Mayor. Can we just go backwards a little bit in the history? At the agreed expenditure of 3.4, I thought originally the Beresford Street portal was included and then it was taken out. So, Cynthia, you're nodding that it was included in the 3.4 originally.
Understand, councillor, that it
Sorry,
was.
3.4 was
No,
that's the total cost of the whole project. That is in the public arena. That can be talked about.
No, that's wrong.
Originally.
Well, wait on. I'm just listening to the mayor and the staff member. Thanks, councillor. So, and then it was taken out subsequent. At what point, what month, year was it taken out?
Councillor, I don't have visibility. We'd have to go back and have a look at the reason it was taken out and when. I don't understand. I don't have visibility of it. I do understand it had left Auckland Transport, and I'm not trying to defend.
Can help.
Yeah,
No,
councillor,
please.
I don't know. I don't know the answer completely.
Mayor, I rely on staff inputs, technical inputs, and I can't trust your input either, councillor.
Okay.
Mayor, it's not the job of councillors.
Sorry. I think we have the answer that Cynthia, you'll have a look at that and come back to us. But I think almost certainly we were under constraints of finance at the time, and there was enormous pressure to reduce the costs in any way that would make it acceptable to the government of the day. And that's fine, I'm all in favour of reducing costs, but you should not be reducing costs to the point that you do things that are ridiculous relating to future-proofing and are unacceptable in relation to safety and accessibility.
Second question then, Mr Mayor.
Councillor?
Is there's an assumption that we pick up half the cost because we have signed the agreement to meet 50% of the expenditure. I'm of the understanding that the new government is committing to the RTN, this is the RTN, on a 100% government-funded capital program. If this is an amendment to the original design, is there really scope for us to explore with government that, consistent with the light rail program and their commitment to picking up the RTN fully funded capital and OPEX, as it mirrors the state highway network, is there not scope for us to discuss with them government picking up 100% of this additional cost?
I'm not quite sure who that should go to. My answer to that is the assumption that the government is making at this point is that the extension of the scope to the CRL will be funded in the same way as the main agreement on CRL was funded. The government's assumption very clearly is that we are meeting half of this, you know, there's always scope. As the councillor knows, there will be a run-on effect of having at some point in the future to expand the wider rail network, and I think our argument is much stronger at that point to require the government to meet 100% of the rail link, but not in relation to the city rail link, because that's encompassed within the existing agreement. But Mark or Cynthia may wish to comment on that.
Councillor, I think it's a good question, but I think from my understanding, through the GPS and through the National Land Transport Fund, the fare rates and the transitional rail is being revisited, and that might be the opportunity. I'm not sure about retrospectively, and certainly AT wouldn't lead the discussion about revisiting the contract that you're under now.
But just to expand
if I could just add to that, perhaps we're dealing with this in the context of signed-up agreements with the Crown. So we have a project delivery agreement and a sponsors agreement with the Crown, which says that the project, whatever the scope of that is, will be the costs will be split 50-50. What we're doing here is asking to change the scope of the project, but still within the same contractual framework. So if yes, you can always ask, but we have signed up agreements, and that's sort of getting into quite a political discussion, which perhaps is best left in your hands rather than ours.
Well, good. So, look, I'm just I want to explore this. I'm interested in possibly varying the contract. We're varying the design. I know, I've written contracts. You can vary your contract with your builder. You can vary where the costs fall. And all I'm asking is, are we exploring that?
I've got to say that under the project delivery agreement and the sponsors agreement, the signal has been sent to me very clearly that this expansion of scope comes within those two existing agreements. We cannot unilaterally change it. I think your point, Councillor Darby, is should we be seeking to renegotiate it? I think that there will be opportunities other than this where we have a stronger case to require central government to shoulder more of the burden. My assessment at this point is that there is no willingness on the part of the government, this government or the previous one, to change the nature of the sponsors agreement or the project delivery agreement. I am sympathetic to your request, but I think you have to choose your time and you have to choose the point at which you think that you can best succeed. We've just come out of a Auckland Transport Alignment project where we have picked up some billions of dollars in extra Crown funding, and I think we just need to assess where and when we can best make the case for a change in the balance of responsibility in this area.
Mayor, I'll leave it there because I just think it's important for discussion. I mean, the benefits of this variation, this design variation and variation in the scope will create capacity benefits right across the rail network and likely across the new light rail network as well. We are talking about a network of public transport, and those benefits by this improved, this variation of scope will be felt in a positive way right across that network. And that's why I'm arguing it.
And the costs that will come across the wider network will be considerably more than what we're contemplating here, and that is the point at which I think the government will be more susceptible to the case that you're making.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think I'd better stop there too. Further questions? We've got Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, can I just make a request first in terms of the language that's being used? So far I've heard FAR, GPS, RTN, APT. Obviously there's ATAP, and I could rattle off a string of others. As much and all as this is a discussion amongst ourselves, it's being videoed, and the public of Auckland are listening to this, hopefully some of them, and they'd wonder what's going on. They're not going to understand those things. So if people could just expand on the acronym, that'd be really helpful, and I'd suggest helpful for us as well. So got a few questions, most of which I've given to Eddie. First of all, around future-proofing. Is the CRL being future-proofed for integration with possible heavy rail to the North Shore? And by integration, I mean seamless integration at grade.
There is future-proofing for a line to come from the North Shore to Aotea Station. It's not planned for that to be at grade. It'll be similar to what you'd find in a place like London at Holborn Station, where there's the Central Line and the Piccadilly Line at different levels. There are disadvantages, of course, to joining tracks from a signalling point of view. By the time we get to needing North Shore Rail, potentially, City Rail Link itself will be full, and to add in more trains coming in on those same tracks would detract from the number of trains you could run through the City Rail Link. So it isn't actually necessarily the best way to go.
In terms of the future-proofing, if it's not at the same level, is there future-proofing for an appropriate level for integration?
Well, I think, as I said, there is future-proofing for North Shore Rail to come into Aotea Station at a different level, and that's been built into the designs. I think that has obviously been deemed sufficient by those who've scoped up the project originally. Yes.
So we don't need any adjustment in the scope at this point for some form of integration?
I might just defer to AT on that one.
Councillor, can I just ask my rail expert to come up? I'm not actually the rail expert for CRL. I will get more involved, but Damien, can you just come and explain how that integration works, please?
Through you, Your Worship, there's a high level of future-proofing underneath Aotea Station.
Could you start again and speak up, thanks?
There's a very high-level provision for future-proofing under Aotea Station. So the structural components of Aotea Station will allow you to put another station box underneath it. The design of that is not obviously fully detailed, and all the systems in Aotea Station will be sized for the people that would use the other line. But we haven't got a detailed design. It's a concept design.
So we don't need any change in scope around ventilation, issues to do with access, egress, safety, any of those things?
Not at this point.
Okay. And in respect of future-proofing to accommodate an extension of the heavy rail to the airport, which could still be an option that's more economical, faster than light rail, is that something that this future-proofing accommodates?
Councillor, I'll answer that one through the chair. We are not looking at heavy rail to the airport. It has been we're not progressing that at all, and we won't be looking at it any further. We've been given clear guidance, and AT support the fact that we are doing a light rail system to the airport, and so we're not planning to do any more or rail planning for heavy rail to the airport.
Terrible.
Having said that, if it became more economical or there are other reasons to have heavy rail to the airport, conceivably in addition to light rail or slow trams, is that possible? Is it future-proofed?
You would be changing the service pattern, so yes, you would divert one of the existing services to the airport and through.
Okay. Another question just around future-proofing, and that goes to accelerated sea level rise and climate change. Quite obviously that's something that conceivably can affect the Britomart area and underground services. Is that future-proofed?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And then the other question is around the modelling, and I can appreciate that we're being told in this additional information that the present model is being replaced by a macro public transport model, and that is underway. What is the timing of that model and the information that will inform it as it goes to future-proofing?
Councillor, the model's just been tested, peer tested from internationals from overseas. Obviously internationals are from overseas. But it's just been peer tested, and it'll be in place in the next, I think our first run is in November. Got to understand, when you model, you also do sensitivity testing. So there's always future-proofing in modelling in terms of going forward. The model, if you run a macro model now, it won't change what's been shown in terms of your demand for what's being planned at the moment.
Okay, and as far as the modelling is concerned, are we taking a scenario approach, and that's conceivably plurals, scenarios, as compared to often our incremental approach? And are we future-proofing for an integrated transport system that involves a very significant shift to public transport, such as we see in many other cities? And I say that because we've got more cars in Auckland than just about any other city on the planet. So we're talking about possibly a quantum shift there. And does that scenario take into account a heavy rail system that's maximised out, that is tapping into a much wider area, given that people can use that heavy rail system from the north, from the south to come to the airport and so on, and is factoring in light rail, a quantum shift in ferries, run according to, say, a network, which is the case in Sydney, much better cycling provision, walkway provision, all of those things. So really, best.
Councillor, with the modelling, we will model based on population demand. We will design an ATAP, the Auckland Transport Alignment Plan, for those people who don't know that acronym, has modelled based on what, in fact, the first ATAP modelling was based on a 30-year plan, 3 decades. We need to be very careful about how we approach this, because you need to model based on what your demand is and not try to get ahead of the curve. You have to have best value for money. We are spending ratepayers' money, and truthfully, you can buy as much public transport as you want, and we should, and we are doing the best we can, but we cannot spend infinitum without it being sensible and a balanced system. So, you know, we do want the quantum shift. There is no doubt there is a reliance on cars, and the board has made it very clear to us on the ELT that we have to make the quantum shift. Aucklanders themselves know that. The congestion is making it very difficult for people to move around the city. We want to have accessibility to education and to employment, and the quantum shift is happening, but it's a behavioural shift. It's not just about us sitting around the table and AT, all the councillors saying we have to have a quantum shift. The behaviour has to change in Auckland as well. We will make those opportunities for Aucklanders for the change, but it is behaviour change as well.
So just to refresh my question, my question is not based around cost constraints. That's the history that's put us into the situation. We've got a harbour bridge that's not fit for purpose, and all sorts of things that are not fit for purpose, and not doing Robbie's plans back in the 1970s when we should we know all of that.
Councillor, please can you come to the question?
So that's the context. So my question is, are we modelling these sorts of scenarios?
Yes, councillor.
Thank you.
And I think, if I can just add to that, I think if we go back to a point Ed made right at the beginning when he introduced to this, CRL is part of your solution. It is not the only solution here, and that also coming into the CBD, if you look at what's planned in the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, is other rapid transport networks, investment in walking and cycling, optimising the bus network. So CRL is part of that solution to the capacity problem.
And just one other question. What we see in other cities around underground networks are underground pedestrian ways, conceivably underground shopping centres and the like. So there's a whole switch because you've got large numbers of people at those levels. Does our work make those sorts of things possible at a later point?
No, councillor, it doesn't at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Mike Lee.
I think I'll reserve my comments to when I can speak, but I guess there is one obvious question, and it does need to be asked, given the concerns about confidentiality. We can talk about 2.4 billion and 3.4 billion, but not about the details of this particular initiative. But I am concerned, and I would like to ask, how did Simon Wilson get to know that the cost of this would be in the low 100 millions?
I can answer that, Councillor. What is important is that when you talk about figures, you're talking about a range of figures that will be within what we anticipate our projected companies will tender for. What is important is to keep the specificity of those figures out of it, and we shouldn't be using the specific figures yet because we won't know until we've got the response to the request for proposals. We won't know sufficiently accurately what the level of cost is most likely to be.
Thank you for the commercial advice, but I did ask a question. Who told Simon Wilson that information?
I told Simon Wilson that information, and within the context that I've just explained to you.
The councillors were briefed.
Councillor, we can have a to and fro. Would you like to ask substantive questions to the people that we've got along here today? Okay, Councillor John Watson.
I've just got some comments, Mr Mayor.
Okay, comments. Councillor Casey, question or comments?
Yes, sorry, I had another one. There was, at the workshop, there was some discussion about the value of elevators versus lifts. Can I just get some clarification if that's all been sorted? As part of the future-proofing, did I get that wrong?
Yeah, I asked the question.
Did you ask the question? Right.
Last time.
Sorry, I don't recall that discussion. And I'm not an expert on the systems within stations either.
I can ask it again.
If you can remember what the question
Yeah,
was.
I can
It's
ask
possible,
the
Terry.
same question I asked it last time at the workshop.
Okay.
That was that.
And that was around the provision of escalators, especially for the K Road facility, as compared to lifts.
I'm sorry, I still don't understand what the question actually is.
So,
I think the question is, now that we're having Beresford back in, we are using escalators as at one access point, and we're using elevators for the Mercury Lane entrance point. That was the question, and you've confirmed that that's the case.
Didn't think that
I'm
was.
sorry, that's not information I know the answer to.
That was the answer I think that we got the other day. Escalators, of
Well,
course,
it was
aren't.
a bit more equivocal than that. That's why
Yeah.
I'm asking it again.
I asked for
wasn't
future-proofing for escalators in all options.
I'm sorry,
at all
we'll need to
locations.
take that question to City Rail Link Limited. I just don't know the designs well enough.
Okay. Councillor Casey, you finish?
No, it
Yep.
was that.
Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question is around, I should say, the language around what we're using. And Cynthia, maybe for you, future-proofing, when we talk about in transport, your experience internationally, what kind of time frame are we actually talking about?
Depending on the service councillor, in buses we can future-proof within years. In rail, 10, 20. You don't really go past the between 30 and 40 because your service patterns change based on your demand. Everywhere across the world, you know, I've heard the discussion around the room, and I've heard it anecdotally about are we future-proofing enough? Well, experience around the world is you never future-proof public transport enough. You could spend you could continue to spend and spend and spend, but you have to decide at a point what the city can afford and what's the best, what's your best spend for the city. And I think in this case, from my experience and what I've read, is that the 9-car investment is the right decision at the right time for this city. We don't know what's going to happen in 50 years in terms of the city. We don't know what's going to happen economically in the world. Mr. Trump's around, it might be a different approach to what it is if somebody else is around. But, and I probably shouldn't make political statements.
Back to transport.
But back to transport, that's right. But, I think it is really, demand is very hard and nobody around the world seems to get it right. If London had got it right, they certainly wouldn't be delivering the cross-city rail now. If Sydney had got it right, we wouldn't have a density change, and we're still talking on our railways here of a density of people of 2.6 people per square metre on the trains. In Sydney, we were starting to plan for 6, and in Tokyo, they use 8. So, there's different levers for different reasons. The 9-train car set now is the right decision, but there will be other levers to work with demand, how you manage passenger flow, your platform management. So there are other levers, but this is the right thing now for the time. You certainly do not want to go back and have to retrofit, which is the evidence that I've seen.
So my question is then back to you, Your Worship, because in the workshop that we had, there was quite a bit of discussion about is future-proofing, okay to use the terminology for the man in the street. I mean, if you Google future-proofing, it talks about the distant future. But what we've just heard is a different answer, and I just think that in our messaging we need to be really clear that we're talking about maybe a set period of time so people don't think this is going to be fine for 50 years.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. What is really clear is that it made no sense at all to find that within 10 years of completing the City Rail Link, you'd have to close it for 2 years in order to do what you should have done at the beginning. So that's absolutely clear. My understanding is that this will take us out into an estimated period such as the 2040s. If we try to future-proof beyond that, there are too many things that we don't know. We don't know what the new technology will be. We don't know what the new shape of the city as we strive to get a more compact city. There are all of those things. So you have to try to find the sweet spot we are not experts around this table, but we're here to represent the public interest. And what we are getting is a combined piece of advice from a range of different agencies, all of whom are saying this is the right place to land at this point.
So my question back to you is the words, rather than future-proofing, should we start using words like this will maximise the asset for what it, because but what I'm reading is you can't actually make it any, you can't future-proof it any further. This is as far as it will go. Is that correct?
Optimise the asset. Optimise the asset is
So I just think
Yeah.
those words, I think we just, I'm not, don't want to pick up, splits hairs or whatever it is, but I
Yeah.
just think that I didn't get it, and you could see there were about 8 councillors that shared the view at the workshop that the terminology gave us a different expectation. So I just wonder whether
Future-proofing has a
Connotation.
limited context, and what we're doing here, if we agree to do this, is on the best advice and the joint advice of a range of people whom we presume to have expertise in this area. So, we don't make this decision lightly. You can do twice as much as we're planning to do at twice the cost, but the advice we're getting is it's not sensible to do that at this point.
And my last question is, if we do what we do now, we don't have to shut down anything in the future, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Because once you've got how many people using this on a daily basis?
This would take us up to around 54,000 people
So you
per hour.
disrupt 54,000 people per hour, per week, or
At peak hour.
peak hour for glory knows how long, would be a huge disruption to any city.
Councillor, it won't be the 54,000. They will all move back onto your transport network. It will disrupt the whole city. It will close your city down.
That's the answer I was looking
Yeah,
for, thank you.
why in my view this is a no-brainer is that if you had to close the City Rail link for 10 years after opening it, that would produce chaos and massive cost to the city. This is a no-brainer in that regard.
Those are the points I wanted to make in public, thank you.
Right, there are no further questions. We'll just take some comments. Question or comment,
Oh, no,
Councillor?
it's a comment.
Okay, you've put your hand up first. Councillor Hills.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair, and thank you for everyone here, and thanks to the City Rail Link team for the other day's workshop. This is fantastic that we are finally sort of growing up just in time, and getting it done and moving forward, because we couldn't have, the city closing down, basically. I've asked this the first couple of times City Rail Link presented to the board, and whether it was the political climate or the whatever the justifications were, and unfortunately at the time some disappointing comments in the media that were then corrected around Beresford Station and some other issues around the 9-car platforms. This is future-proofing to the maximum. Like we had the discussion the other day, you can't future-proof one asset or route forever. You need to then decide another. Which is why we are doing light rail in different areas. You have to have different models. You're not going to continue to build on one place forever. But this is crucial. I could never understand why Beresford was taken off the list. There's complicated things on all sides, and why the platforms weren't going to be done as they are looking to be happening now. The Beresford station, not only is it fantastic for people who of all access because of the incline of the Mercury Lane, but it actually opens up the catchment much, much wider. And if we were serious about encouraging all types of people out of cars, as you say, parking cars in disability spaces, it's about making sure that the system, public transport system, works for everyone and is safe and easy to use for everyone. But also the catchment, it just makes so much more sense for everything. It's flat access to the hospital, basically. You've got all the area around there for homes and places. Plus, it's just another exciting addition to the whole thing. The other thing is you can't future-proof forever around the double-decker trains, and if you went to 12, you'd end up slowing down the network because of people getting it on and off the train. So this is another piece of the puzzle that is clear that we need to do, and I'll definitely be supporting the move forward on this, because we just couldn't, and I don't think it'll be 10 years we'd be closing the City Rail Link down. I think it'll be 5, with the way that the last 4 years to increase train patronage from 10 million to 20. It's much like the Northern Busway, 2.5 million to 5.3 in 4 years. We're just getting people getting public transport exponentially, and it will continue to grow because we're investing in the system, making it easier for not everyone yet, but the more people you can make it a clear, obvious, easy, affordable way to travel around a city, the short trips, long trips. And the City Rail Link does affect the whole city. It will, a lot of it is about west and south and central, but also it makes more space on the network for our buses from the shore. For now, we're at the moment, we've, have the odd day we have 10 to 15 buses stuck in a line on Wellesley or Queen and other things. So this will help alleviate some of that until we get rail to the shore ASAP after this. So just want to say thank you for everyone involved, and I kind of can't believe that we've got to this so quickly in the end, but just in time, really, if you think about it. So it's a no-brainer. It would actually be a huge risk to the city, but also we'd be totally irresponsible, I think, not to support this, because in the very near future, we'll be putting our whole city's transport system at risk. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've just got a few general comments in light of your, restrictions on the costs. Sure. Fair enough. That go to this change of project scope, and of course, I would suggest for most people out in the public, there will be more interested in the change of project cost, I think, and if you don't mind, Mr. Mayor, I'll just set that in a little bit of a historical context, because it doesn't seem too long ago that a couple of the colleagues around the table, not least of which was good Councillor Quacks, had written to the Auditor General in mid-2016, really just asking, concerned, but just really seeking some reassurance about how big a bill the ratepayers are going to be landed with. So that was back in 2016, and that was when the cost for the City Rail Link was sitting around about 2.5 billion. So they had concerns 2 years ago at 2.5 billion. They were reassured at that time by an unidentified AT spokesperson who said they can have confidence in the robust level of scrutiny, planning and design that has gone into the CRL, and the strong national and international team that has been handpicked to get it to happen. So there was a reassurance of sorts there that I kind of took in my layman's view, that all things were being looked into with a degree of scrutiny, and future-proofing or a robust network or planning was taking place. Not long after that, only a few months in fact, there was a further revelation in September 2016, which announced that the City Rail Link cost was confirmed, has blown out was the term used at that point, to between 2.8 billion and 3.4 billion. So that was between those relative amounts there. We now know that it's sitting on 3.4 billion and clearly likely to go up significantly from that 3.4 billion. A number of people at the time, around about 2017, were asking about this cost that could be as high as 3.4 billion, was the term used, not least of which was you, Mr. Mayor, who quite rightly, with quite a degree of public support there, are asking how these costs could be underestimated, whether new estimates could be relied upon, and really seeking assurances that the project would be delivered on time and within budget. And I would say that was a very, common sentiment, not just held by you, but by a number of other councillors and certainly the wider Auckland public. It's now going up again. What that may end up with, I don't know, but I guess just from that public perspective, in a fairly short space of time, and I understand about the patronage, how it's, hit marks faster than what people had anticipated, but I would say if we're talking about that City Centre Future Access Study, that was done in 2012, so I would have thought there would have been some upgrading along the way before we had that more indicative cost that was put out into the public arena that might have been a little more reflective of potential changes in scope, which I'm not disagreeing with. I'm not arguing against the case of the wiseness in dealing with this in the way that's being suggested. But I guess, Mr. Mayor, at some point, it's kind of Peter and the Wolf territory, isn't it? We're heading fast towards 4 billion from a starting point of 2.5 billion. Where does it end? And that's in a fairly compressed period of time. That's not over a decade's planning. So we've had quite a bit of talk about ratepayers' money. We've got financial implications that we're going to talk about in confidential, but that obviously there are going to be fairly significant financial implications in terms of the council's overall budget. I guess I'm stating the obvious, aren't I? 2.5, 3.4, still going north in a very short space of time. That is very concerning. Councillor Quacks and a couple of his colleagues signalled that back in 2016. We're now 2 years on, and I shudder to think what they would be saying if they're around at the moment. So, yes, very comprehensive case for the change of scope. No, in terms of reassurance over where this might all end up, and I think that will be a sentiment that's pretty widely held across Auckland.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, I mean, like Councillor Watson, mindful of the way in which you've proposed to manage this, Your Worship, in terms of the cost discussion, so I will keep it general. But there is an opportunity cost here, and it will be quite a substantial one. What I can say is that whilst I wasn't a member of the governing body in the past, I would imagine that there were decisions taken that have been judged by local communities to have left a lot of projects fairly emaciated because an opportunity cost was paid then. An opportunity cost is being paid because we have to fund America's Cup, and I worry about the opportunity costs that will have to be paid in the future because we have to make, well, some will call it courageous decisions. Actually, they'll be very painful for ratepayers in the 100 villages of Auckland. Richard, Councillor Hills, I agree with you. There is huge risk, and it would be totally irresponsible not to proceed with doing the work that has been proposed. You could argue that there was huge risk, and it was totally irresponsible not to take these decisions at the time that the project was agreed previously. Exactly. We are taking a decision to address a legacy error.
No, that's not.
It's a debatable point. My colleagues can take a call if she wants. But from my perspective, we are having to do painful retrofitting of decisions to ensure that we can actually address a matter that needed to be resolved previously. And I am quite sure that the Board of Auckland you can take a call soon, Councillor Hulse.
I'm just putting up my hand to do so. Thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm quite sure that the Board of Auckland Transport previously considered a series of recommendations around the scope of the project that could have made it better. I suspect some of those recommendations weren't taken at the time, and more's the pity. But I do think, Your Worship, that one thing that will need to come to the fore very soon is going to be the consequence in terms of the wider CapEx program as a result of the changes that will have to be taken in the future. I'm uncomfortable with the sequence of this because I kind of feel that I'm being boxed into a process, and I have a concern actually that the cost will just continue to expand. Where is the limit to that? I'm not necessarily comforted by the fact that the Crown looks to take half the cost, because that's only half the cost. There's a lot more cost to come. If you go out of sequence with government, and I think that we have previously been out of sequence with government, then there is a cost to be paid. The timetable for the CRL was always going to be a better timetable if the Crown was on board from day one. The Crown was on board on its timetable. If we want to go on a different timetable, then we have to wear the cost of that, but the costs will be substantial. So, Your Worship, I wanted to make those comments, which I think are general comments at this time because of the way in which you want to handle the conversation around costs, but since this is a debate which is wide-ranging now for public record, I did want to record my remarks, notwithstanding the fact that I have concern. I can absolutely see the need to proceed on this, but I do feel that this takes us down a path towards a very expensive program that will have implications for the... And the last thing I will say is that this is not future-proofing the network per se, actually, because you know, as the City Rail Link is successful and you put more train services out on the Southern Line, we're not dealing with grade separation on the Southern Line right now. I mean, there is a need for overbridges on the Southern Line and the Inner Western Line. You know, there is road congestion that's being caused by more trains operating, and Cynthia Gillespie knows this, and she's going to have to try and tackle this with Kiwi Rail. But there are other consequences across the network that create disadvantage for people outside of the central city. So I look forward to Auckland Transport coming back to us with options and timing for further investment to address those gaps that will emerge as a result of the City Rail Link coming on stream and putting more commuter trains, particularly on the Southern Line south of the Papakura Stream. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The cheapest time to have done this project would have been 45 years ago. And unfortunately, there was not the intestinal political fortitude around at that time to make those difficult decisions. And finally, I've delivered some of that intestinal fortitude in more recent times. And Councillor Watson is right when he quoted his figures of 2.5, then somewhere between 2.5 and 3.4. However, between those dates when the project was first announced and now, some things have changed. And one of those is this better identification of what the actual project is, because once you get the green light, you can start delving down into a bit more detail. And we're not finished with the detail yet, and we won't be finished with that till we get to the tender process early 19. The other thing, of course, that's happened is we've come out of the GFC, where we had a flatline construction sector, into a sector we have now where construction inflation is running plus 7%. So in the 2 years, you've got a 15% increase in costs, or thereabouts, regardless of what you want. So that's a real challenge. And I have no doubt that there will be new and different things come with this process that we're going to have to do and make some hard political, intestinal fortitude decisions around. But it goes back to the same premise. It's never going to be cheaper than today. Councillor Newman is correct that we do have some challenges around how are we going to do all the other things that a network that's running a train every 8 or 10 minutes is going to bring complications with, plus third and potentially fourth tracking. And that's going to take a whole new discussion about how we finance these options. And is it going to be through modern, more sophisticated methods, or are we just going to keep stinging the old ratepayer? And that's decisions we're going to have to make. So it's, again, it comes back to that political intestinal fortitude. Mr Mayor, we just need to move on. It's not easy, it sometimes is painful, but we need to move on.
Thank you very much. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I wasn't around when the decision was made to give the CRL the go-ahead, but I am now, and I suppose, I think like yourself, I was one of these people that wanted to keep on time and on budget. But what I've learned since, you know, the project was first started and today, as a result of the workshop we had and even more today, is that there is, you know, so much happened from the first day to today. And one of the things is, I think for the first time in the history of Auckland, that we really are getting people out of cars and onto public transport. So whilst this is one project that we're discussing today, it's actually one of a number of things, all right? So if you're going to do something, you do it once and you do it properly. The things that concerned me about what you said today, Cynthia, was the fact that we could cripple Auckland in the future if we don't do it once and do it right. That really concerned me, you know, the volumes of people that potentially will use the CRL, to actually stop them using it and try and find alternatives over quite a considerable period of time, actually adds to the argument that we do have no choice. Some of you might know I'm sort of generational in this game, and my grandfather was responsible for giving the go-ahead to the Harbour Bridge. And I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but the example that it did go from a wider project to a smaller project. He first wanted it bigger, but actually people got nervous and said, no, make it smaller, we can't afford it. What happens, it actually ended up costing a lot more, not just because of time, but because it disrupted the cars going over it in the first time. Waterview Tunnel, 9 years. Where are we? We're at capacity now almost. So I think we need to be brave and bold, and at least, if we're not using the words future-proofing, at least we are building it to capacity as well we can. The cost does bother me, and I know that's not a discussion for today, but I think I'll have that discussion you know, in the next session. Cost, of course, bothers me, but there is no cheaper time to do anything than today. So I give my support to what we're trying to do. I give my support in the realisation that Auckland is using rail and public transport in a way that they have never used it before. And to do what we're doing now will ensure that that continues to happen, and even more Aucklanders have the ability to travel freely on a system that is designed as part of an integrated transport system that will take this city to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for Councillor Newman inviting me to speak. I wasn't going to. I just want to pay tribute to our two representatives who are on Auckland Transport for supporting this right from the word go, and to have done that at that time was not easy, because I'm also going to pay tribute to Len Brown, who stood staunchly behind his train set at a time when it was treated with derision and humour, and he was laughed at. And I think this is actually finally the project that we were thinking about those years ago. And I think, Councillor Simpson, your words are very wise. You know, it's difficult to be brave, and it's easy to be talked out of things. And we were talking to a government at the time, as you said, Mr Mayor, who were not just disinterested in this project. They were dismissive, and they were downright rude about the project. So it's not surprising that compromises were made to at least get this over the line. Things have changed in 9 years, and we're now having a reasonable and rational conversation with a reasonable, rational group of people about the future, which is exactly where the conversation should be. Yes, the finance is an issue, but it is never going to be cheaper, exactly as the Deputy Mayor said. So why I bridled and inappropriately commented from the side when Councillor Newman talked about mistakes or a bad process or whatever the comment was, mistakes were not made. These issues were absolutely known to us. We knew that it was a compromise decision that we were endeavouring to get across the line, because we were dealing with Stephen Joyce, who was not interested nor supportive nor understanding of this project and was utterly dismissive. So I guess if I do bridle at the statement that mistakes were made, it's in defence of our senior staff, our ELT, Auckland Transport, our two representatives on AT, the Mayor at the time, and the councillors who were brave enough to pursue this issue. I think we are going forward very sensibly, and I acknowledge from the bottom of my heart your staunchness around this issue. I think Auckland will look in favour at the elected members and the two mayors responsible for making this happen. And I think some of the questions that were raised on the Audit Office and all the rest of it was simply done to try and stop a decision being made and to move the project forward. So let's not be like the people who stopped Desley's grandfather from making a brave and good decision. I think we simply do need to get on with it, and there's not a lot more to say. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure, and these aren't questions. I'm making the assumption that we're speaking to it now.
Yep.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, this is comments.
Okay. So I'm certainly supportive in principle of what is proposed, because it's going to produce a better outcome and deliver significantly more capacity. No question about that. As far as the process is concerned, I've got a number of things that I'd like to put on the table. It's very refreshing that we're having this discussion in public. It would have even been better if the item had been split so that we had a public part to it that was publicly available and a confidential part that could have gone to the confidential numbers. And I say that because there's huge public interest in this. Huge public interest. Secondly, it would have been very useful if we had have had a bit more time. And I'd ask the writers and the authors of this report how long it takes a person to read this, digest it, and maybe formulate some questions around it. And I think the timing of that in terms of giving it to councillors needs to be taken into consideration, because we didn't get this until a little earlier this week. And this is a very important document. It's a very important issue. So I would hope, Mr. Mayor, that going forward we don't have more and more and more really big items and contentious items and very strategic items given to us at literally the last minute when we've got an existing program that's already heavy. So I hope that the officers all hear that, and that those such as yourself also hear that. That's important. The other point that I'd just like to make, which really go to my comments around future-proofing, it's not simply future-proofing that goes to cost, it's future-proofing around identifying potential integration, potential design changes that don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. So that if we do want to integrate some walkways, some underground retail, all of these things that happen in other cities, if we do want to integrate escalators or other things, that we've made the right provisions, so we've protected the designations and the like, and those things can happen. So that is my concern. I'd also like to say that I support the comments that Councillor Darby made about the possibility of renegotiation with the government. Because what we've got is a link that is not just a link for Auckland, it's a link for the entire upper North Island, because people are going to be coming into Auckland from Hamilton and further south and from north. They're going to be coming to Auckland to go to the airport, to go to all sorts of things. We know that the motorway network at large, not just in Auckland but outside that, is under stress, and that billions of dollars are being spent. And I'm addressing this to the government because I hope the government's listening. I'm sure they are. And they really need to come to the party around this. This is a New Zealand Inc. project. Far more so in many respects than it is an Auckland Inc. project. We're the driver very largely of the Auckland economy, visitation, people going to the airport, people visiting Auckland and so on. So really I agree with Councillor Darby that we need to go into bat with the government around this, and in that respect I'd certainly like to see much more elaboration of point 38, I think it is, which gives the comparison between spending a bit more on this project to deliver a really big increase in capacity of the number of people that can use it, compared to the amount that would have to be spent on the motorway network or the rail network or whatever, which are many, many billions of dollars more. Mm-hmm. And that's all money that the government would have to be spending. Yes. Serious money. And this is better. So hopefully they get it. The other point that I'd make that goes to process, I raised the issue around the risks and costs associated with this project in the long-term plan process. And I addressed those questions directly to Matthew Walker. And my concern is that various people, that includes Auckland Transport and the CRLL team, obviously knew about these escalations some time ago. And really they could have brought us information, I think, a lot earlier, so that our long-term plan process could have reflected on some of this, because as I've said, the big ticket items in the tender process, they're yet to come. And I think I would suggest there's every likelihood that we will, following up on comments that my fellow councillor John Watson made, possibly see further escalation. And what are the risks around that? I don't know, but they obviously impact on everything that this council spends money on. So there's some comments that I'd make. I'd like to see them or something on them incorporated in some later reports and some commentary, and certainly picked up by officers and the mayor who's leading this process. But back to my first point, yes, I'm supportive.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you. I think it's a fair thing to say that we, as elected members, are very much reliant on expert advice, officer advice, and advice that comes from Auckland Transport and now CRLL. I've been associated with this project since it was first proposed back in, I think it was 2008, in the Auckland Regional Council, Auckland Regional Transport Authority days. The business case was prepared during that time and completed in the first, or launched in the first months of the Super City early in 2011, and the price in that business case was the 2.4 to 2.8 billion. As other councillors have mentioned or reminded us, there was quite a debate around this project. It wasn't really about cost so much or benefits. It was essentially political or even philosophical, and there was a rival project, namely the Puhoi to Wellsford road of national significance. So I guess in that debate we all took sides in a partisan way. I certainly argued long and hard for the CRL, both within this room and of course being supportive as a director of Auckland Transport. That price stayed around that 2.4, 2.8 mark for quite some time. However, around about 2014, if we're talking about future-proofing now, I guess a reverse process took place, and that was stripping out some of the amenities, some of the benefits of the CRL. For instance, the Karangahape Road second entrance at Beresford Place, though that was never ever meant to be permanent. That was just put on the back burner. What was permanent, unfortunately, was the removal of the Newton station, which I believe would have been of enormous benefit for this city. But perhaps even more problematic than that, something that's not widely known, is that the future-proofing to the North Shore, which was part of the accepted planning going back to Auckland City Council days with the Britomart station, turns out to be non-linear. Now, I'm deeply concerned about that lack of future-proofing, and I'm deeply concerned that it's not widely known. Now, it's in terms of rail economics, to have a second, what is in effect a second self-contained rail network in New Zealand separate from all the rest. And when I say all the rest, rolling stock can go from the Britomart station. Let me say further. Rolling stock can go from the Bay of Islands down to Bluff on the same tracks. A rail ferry in between. But however, what we are talking about here, and it's a cardinal error that future generations will not thank us for, is that there is no linear continuity between the New Zealand rail network and any proposed North Shore heavy rail service. I think that's a huge mistake, and I'd really ask the planners to think again about that before it is too late, seeing we are reconfiguring tenders. What I'm concerned about, Mr. Mayor, is the process. And members have mentioned the long-term plan process, whereby we went out and consulted with the people of Auckland over our $70 billion LTP for the next 10 years, and didn't mention this at all, even though it would appear that the need for this escalation was known as early as September 2017. I think it's a pretty poor show. So I come back to my original point. We are reliant on advice from people we believe to be experts, but I have to be frank with you. I don't have complete confidence. I'm aware that in terms of patronage, projections were changed when patronage started flatlining after 2011. I don't believe this is entirely about patronage. I have a suspicion it's also about the same old cost escalation we have to deal with a whole lot of projects. But however, we have to accept this on face value, but I do have some questions. I'm aware that last time we had a deputation from AT, it was to persuade us to spend $200 million on battery trains. And that was not once, but twice. And where, may I ask, has the battery train idea gone? Into the rubbish bin where it should have been in the first place. There are other figures in the business case talking about light rail, 80 kilometres at 2.4 billion. That completely is out of whack with the figures that are being bandied around for the 20 kilometres to Auckland Airport light rail, which is 3+ billion. So that doesn't instill a great deal of confidence. The other concern we have is that this time we're up at our borrowing limits. This is very, very serious. And so I would urge fellow members to think very carefully about the need, and it may be imposed on us, but I think we should be thinking about it now of an independent review of the whole CRL process.
2 minutes, mate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. You had your full time plus a full extension. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. So, look, I hope my prickly questions about reviewing the contract with the government weren't misread before, but it is something that we're going to have to examine in the long run. That is the far rate, the assistance that we get from the government. And I would hope that that financial assistance rate on the RTN moves to 100% in the short term, I would hope. But members, I guess what we're looking at here is a success story as well. This is actually the very pointy end of the transport revolution that many of us have talked about for a decade. I certainly have, and I know some others here have, and it's probably come at us quite a bit quicker than we ever thought. And we know those numbers. Mark, you've been there at the helm right through, and you have been forecasting these numbers, and then we've been punching well through those forecasts, and we've been struggling to keep up with the capital build. And here is a big one that's come at us because the transport revolution is not arriving, it's arrived, and we didn't quite wake up to the fact that it had arrived rather than was about to descend upon us. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1950s, let's face it. But what interests me is that this is not just a transport revolution now. We're starting to see housing data, consent data come through from the last 12 months, which confirms that on the rapid transit network, which is only 2.6% of the land area, 40% of the dwelling consents are being issued, which says we've got another problem coming at us. We've got even more people living on that RTN in the very near future that are going to be on the light rail network, the bus network on the Northern Busway, and particularly our rail network. So this is actually a very positive outcome of planning decisions and, Councillor Hulse, the unitary plan, the two coming together to deliver the outcomes that we always wanted, anticipated and planned for. The unfortunate thing, and Councillor Hulse, you have addressed this, is that we always knew that the business case that our team took to Wellington had the stuffing kicked out of it until it was bleeding. And now we're having to bandage this up and address what stuffing was left. And that's the bare bones fact of it, to be honest. So it doesn't surprise me whatsoever. But Mayor, I will conclude, and I will be supporting this absolutely, because if we don't support this, we're basically just putting another motoring mortgage around Aucklanders' necks for another decade, if not more. And they want to get out of their motor vehicles. They want to be in the comfort of trains, buses and ferries, and travelling across a 21st century worthy transport network. But we do have to address the financial assistance rate, and I have a view that we should be urging government seriously to extend the mandate of the NZTA to right across the rapid transit network. Just as they have mandate over the strategic road network, the state highway network, they should have jurisdiction, ownership for CapEx and OpEx entirely, with costs being hinged back to their masters, the government, because that is the backbone of any modern city's transport network. Yep. And it has to be paid for, not by ratepayers to the extent to which it is. And we will also have to interrogate a down scaling of what we actually charge Aucklanders in fares as well, because some of our fares are really getting away on us at the moment, particularly ferries, but many, many other areas. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm supporting this, but I'm also supporting not relenting on the conversation we have to have with government to bring some equity to the funding of Auckland's rapid transit network, the backbone of our public transport system here at the moment, which Aucklanders are paying a disproportionately high number for.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Clow.
Thank you. Like many, I'm certainly very concerned about the financial implications we've got here, and in the report, whilst we can't talk about it, but clearly in F and G, what we're doing with our borrowing limits is of major concern, and we're going to have to be looking at reprioritising certainly by the end of this year with the annual plan process. Unfortunately, we will not have the final contract details on the CRL, some of the projects and contracts that are going out, but we're certainly going to be having to reprioritise. I suppose we could be optimistic that maybe revenue is going to be higher as well, so we're okay. But the perverse thing, and Councillor Darby stole my thunder there, the perverse thing here, this is a good news story. This is a good news story. We've got public transport and rail patronage that's just way exceeding what we thought, so this is why we've got this dilemma coming to us, and whilst of course that has cost implications, it's wonderful news for those of us who are, well, indeed all of us who are advocating for public transport. I just think it would be a real shame, because I did see in the Essentia briefings that came out this week that a program, Jim Moira, on the national program. And maybe he was in a panel and maybe there was a councillor on there or not, but basically it seemed the message coming out from that was a blowout of costs on the CRL. It'd be a real shame if we go out of this and it comes across as though it's a blowout, because this is not a blowout. This is a good news story, and we're just having to readjust things because of the good news. So bad news is if we go around talking about a blowout, I just think that would be a shame, and it's not helping us in trying to push and advocate for public transport in Auckland. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Say, oh sorry, I'm reminded that we have reached the point where I need to move an extension of time. It's been seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Councillor Sayers.
Well, that was fortunate. Thank you.
Hate to cut you off in your prime.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, Mr. Mayor, I, for some reason, I'm probably taking a slightly different lens to all of this. I am finding it a little bit difficult to support. I'm not totally convinced. And I haven't got those high comfort levels that perhaps other councillors have got. And obviously, we're looking at a confidential report here, but you know, councillors have already touched on it. At best, we know that the CRL is going to reach capacity, but just when that is going to occur, at what point in time, we don't actually know that. We have got information in here that it could be in 12 years, 15 years, 20 years, 28, 40 years. We don't actually know. It's a guess as best calculations can predict. So, and a lot of this decision is based on the levels of patronage, and it seems to be a key stone to a lot of the debate in favour of this. So, the budget, in my mind, this is you know, Auckland has seen that the budget for this project crept, and I think they've got to a level where they think at 3.4 billion, that was it. That's what their expectation was. It wasn't going to move any further. And so the way I see it, is the budget for the CRL project is $3.4 billion, and for Auckland Council to spend more now, particularly when at a time when council's debt levels are so high, and when the future patronage projections are at best a guess, I just don't think that's financially sensible. So look, I just don't have, Mr. Mayor, I just don't have the level of confidence that at this time we should be extending the budget beyond 3.4 billion. So when we come to the voting on this, I'll be thinking very carefully about how I cast my vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. If I can wind up this part of the debate. Look, there are... Let me deal with the question of blowout at costs. The reason that we had to go public on this was because somebody went out there and said this was a blowout of costs. This isn't. This is, as a number of you have rightly pointed out, the result of us achieving targets of getting people out of their cars on the motorways at peak hours and onto trains 4 years ahead of what we projected. Now, to that extent, this is a success story. The choice is, of course, we could not do this. We could allow the motorways to grind to a halt. We could decide to do nothing. We can save the pennies now and spend the pounds later. Every one of you have read these papers and know that if we choose that path, it will cost twice as much to do it later, twice as much, and you'll have the massive disruption of closing one of the major forms of public transport into Auckland City for 2 years. Is there a single person around this table that thinks that that is an option? Is there a single person in our community that thinks that that is an option? And the answer is no. That's madness. That's stupidity. We did learn something, didn't we, from Desley's story about the Harbour Bridge, built in 1959, Within 10 years, it was full up and we had to double the size of it. What we are doing now is making a decision before we go out to tender, so it's built in from the beginning, there won't be the disruption, and we can minimise the cost. Now, does it cost money? Of course it costs money. Do we get anything for nothing? Would we like to get more out of central government? Of course. Every opportunity I get, I'm trying to get money out of central government, but I've been there and I know when you can reasonably expect to get more, and we did during the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, and when we can't. And we are bound by a contract that our predecessors on this council have signed. So let's not try to save the money on what is a relatively small amount of expenditure. There are other big items of expenditure coming up, because when we hit these peak traffic flows, we know that we're going to have to do a whole lot more over the rest of the rail network as well. And that's actually by far the more expensive cost. This is a small cost compared to what we're going to have to spend if our city keeps growing by the size of Tauranga every 3 years. So it's a success story in the sense we're getting bums off the single occupant cars and onto trains. It's also a story of short-sightedness, that in an endeavour to cut costs, we made our stations such as Karangahape Road not fit for purpose. That was short-sightedness. And actually, congratulations to those of you that were on the council at the time. Unanimously, you voted for the City Rail Link. I wasn't here at the time. Outside of this place, I supported the City Rail Link because it made sense. Our CBD is growing faster than anywhere else in the country. It produces, Councillor Darby, 16% of the country's GDP in the CBD? It's huge. Can we afford to let our city grind to a halt? Of course we can't. Let's celebrate the growth. Let's do what it's sensible to do. And I am heartened by the fact that almost every councillor around the table that has taken this call has said this is the right thing to do, because so patently, obviously, it is the right thing to do. We need to do it now. We need to do it before we go out to tender. We make the final decision whether we fully fit the station or simply widen the tunnel around the stations at the earliest date, and we'll talk about that in the financial section of this meeting. But let us celebrate we are getting that mode shift. Let us celebrate Councillor Darby's figures that people are doing what we anticipated they'd do. They are building more intensely around the major arterial transport routes, because that's what makes sense to do in a city that's a global city, which is what Auckland is fast becoming. So, councillors, thank you for your contribution to this debate. We have got the choice of voting against the measures. That comes at an enormous cost of retrofitting and an enormous cost of the disruption that simply would not be acceptable and would not be supported by the overwhelming majority of our fellow citizens in this city. So I want to thank officials for their presence here today and their contribution. We're now going to move into the final section of this meeting today to vote on the recommendations and to discuss the dollar sums if that is required. So I will move that we now exclude the public on the basis that what we're about to discuss is commercially confidential. Do I have a seconder for that? It's been seconded. Councillor Clow, I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. And we'll just have a 1 minute break while we clear the room of anybody that's not appropriately here and close the doors.